Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive. And today, we are continuing on and wrapping up the case of Sandra Birchmore, a 23-year-old woman who was found dead in her Canton, Massachusetts apartment on February 4th, 2021. And when Sandra's body was found, an investigation revealed that she'd been in a long-term relationship with married Stoughton police officer Matthew Farwell, who was not only 15 years older than Sandra, but who had been sexually active with her when she was just 15 years old and he was 27. But that was not all the investigation uncovered. It turned out that not only was Sandra 10 weeks pregnant with Matthew's child, but there was more than one police officer in Stoughton who had taken part in what officials have called a deliberate combination of lies, deceit, and treachery that violated the policies and core values of the Stoughton Police Department. Okay, so on May 21st, 2021, the Massachusetts State Medical Examiner's Office performed the autopsy on Sandra Birchmore, and they ruled that her death had been self-inflicted. Sandra's family obviously did not accept this news well, and they never believed in any way, shape, or form that Sandra had taken her own life. There was a lot of reasons for this. Firstly, when they'd gone into Sandra's apartment after the crime scene techs had finished their work, Sandra's family members spotted several things that they believed suggested Sandra had not been planning to end it all. Sandra had seemingly been in the middle of doing laundry, and there was a wet load of clothes in the washing machine and another load of clothes in the dryer. They also spotted a homemade sign, bedazzled with glitter and hope, and it said, "Congratulations, you're going to be a father," along with an ultrasound picture of Sandra's baby. In the apartment sat a brand new baby stroller, still in the box, as well as homemade and store-bought baby onesies, one of which said, "We're going to be parents," with a set of footprints underneath. There were also packages of clothing and other baby items that had been delivered recently, and in the days after Sandra's death, several more packages she had ordered arrived. Most startlingly, they found a necklace that Sandra was known to always wear. It was a chain with a flamingo charm on it, and this necklace was lying on the floor of Sandra's bedroom. The chain was broken, but it wasn't broken at the clasp, meaning somewhere else along the chain it had been pulled and broken. And there was a large clump of Sandra's hair tangled around the chain. Crime scene photos showed that when Sandra's body was found, the necklace was broken and it was hanging from the left side of her neck, with the charm, the flamingo charm, having fallen and landed on the right side of her stomach. Now, when her body had been moved by the medical examiner's office, the necklace and chain must have fallen to the ground, where Sandra's family discovered it later on. Now, previous to this, on February 24th, 2021, Matthew Farwell had been placed on administrative leave, and on April 1st, 2022, he resigned completely from the Stoughton Police Department. After this, Farwell got a commercial driver's license and started a company called DMJ Transportation. This was a trucking business. And maybe Matthew Farwell thought he'd gotten away. Maybe he thought that he could start fresh, and as long as he wasn't a police officer, no one would waste too much time focusing on him. But he was wrong. In September of 2022, the Stoughton Police Department concluded an extensive 19-month internal investigation, not only into the actions of Matthew Farwell, but also into the actions of Matthew Farwell's twin brother, William Farwell, and Robert Dine, former instructor of the police Youth Explorers program that Sandra had been a part of.
A 19-month-long internal investigation has uncovered 3 former police officers allegedly had an inappropriate relationship with a woman who they met when she was a teenager. The report names Matthew Farwell, his brother William, and a former deputy chief, Robert Dine. The police chief says, the current chief, that those 3 men met the woman when she was a teenager and when she was part of an explorers program run by the department. The investigation uncovered hundreds of explicit text messages. The woman died last year after Matthew Farwell broke off their relationship. Her death is still under investigation. The chief is now seeking to get all 3 men decertified so that they can never be police officers in Massachusetts ever again.
All 3 men, the Farwell brothers and Dine, violated their oaths of office and should never have the privilege of serving any community as a police officer through a sustained and deliberate combination of lies, deceit, and treachery. They violated the policies and the core values of the Stoughton Police Department, not to mention human decency.
The chief says there were 2 other men involved, a military recruiter and a police officer who works for another department.
And that's going to bring us to the deeper issue here, because Sandra's case is just one of at least 194 allegations that law enforcement personnel have groomed, sexually abused, or engaged in inappropriate behaviors with youth explorers since 1974. And the vast majority of victims affected were teenage girls. The Marshall Project is a not-for-profit news organization that's focused on reforming the criminal justice system through journalism that exposes injustices, and they did an investigation into the Explorer program. They have said, quote, lack of oversight was partly responsible for the abuse. In many programs, armed officers were allowed to be alone with teenage explorers. In a few instances, departments minimized or dismissed the concerns of those who reported troubling behavior, records show. The officers accused of abusing teenagers spanned the ranks from patrolmen to police chiefs. Some were department veterans, cited in news articles for their community work. A handful had served their agencies for barely a year, and some were married men with families of their own. Many cases led to criminal charges. Some officers went to prison, while others received probation or weren't required to register as sex offenders. A few departments allowed officers to keep their jobs after a reprimand or short suspension. The Marshall Project's analysis found at least 14 departments among 111 agencies that had a history of repeated allegations, end quote. Sandra Birchmore, it appears, was just one of the many victims of this abuse of power, this clear power imbalance where young teens are introduced to a world of law enforcement and entrusted into the care of people who technically had only one job, to protect and serve. But there was no protection happening for these kids like Sandra. When Sandra joined the Stoughton Police Department Explorers program, Robert Dine had been running that program for more than a decade, and he had quickly risen in the ranks from a school resource officer to a deputy police chief. Now, according to the Marshall Project, Dine's supervisors claim he changed the focus of the program from mentoring to a paramilitary-style youth program. My question would be, was this something they discovered afterwards when allegations started coming out about Dine? Or were they aware that while this mentor-style program was changing into a paramilitary youth program, were they aware that it was happening when it was happening? That would be my question, because turning a mentor program into a paramilitary youth group doesn't sound like a positive thing. It doesn't sound like the direction that law enforcement or any police body would want to go in. So I'm just very confused about the timing of that. When were the Stoughton Police Department aware that their youth mentor program was becoming a paramilitary youth group? So Robert Dine, he's the one who brought the Farwell brothers into the program. Dine was in his 30s, the brothers were in their 20s, and Sandra Birchmore was 13 years old. In 2014, Sandra's mother wrote a letter thanking Robert Dine for the positive impact he and the program were having on her daughter. But then, 2 years later, Dine was embroiled in a scandal when it was discovered he was having an extramarital affair and he was being investigated for harassment. He was then demoted from deputy chief to patrolman. Now, the Marshall Project alleges that Sandra was engaged in a sexual relationship not only with Matthew Farwell, but with his brother and with Robert Dine, who has claimed to have had no contact with Sandra whatsoever. But Facebook messages proved otherwise, showing that while on duty, Dine had engaged in conversations about meeting Sandra for sex. Allegedly, this had happened in 2020, and Dine had used a fake Facebook profile to have these conversations. Okay, so the MarshallProject.org has this article. I'll link it in the description box, and it's called In This Police Youth Program, A Trail of Sexual Abuse Across the U.S. And it gives kind of a little bit of a background on the Explorers program. It says the youth program that introduced Birchmore to the officers is among hundreds of such chapters at police agencies around the country. Created by the Boy Scouts of America decades ago, Law Enforcement Explorer posts are designed to help teens and young adults learn about policing. Now, the Boy Scouts, which sets guidelines for Explorer posts, meaning the different police offices that have this Explorer program, they declined a request for an interview, and they did not answer questions about how they enforce their rules for police departments. And records from the Stoughton Police Department showed no evidence that scouting leaders conducted evaluations or made sure that officers were trained to spot and report abuse of young people. And the former director of youth protection for the Boy Scouts told the Marshall Project he was alarmed by the abuse in police Explorer programs. So what it sounds like is there's no oversight. The Boy Scouts of America started this Explorer program, but then they kind of just let different law enforcement agencies set up their branches of the Explorer program, and they're not super on top of monitoring or evaluating how those programs are run. They kind of just let them do their own thing. That's what it sounds like to me. The article goes on to talk about many instances of abuse allegations in big and small departments spanning much of the country. In Connecticut, an officer first tried to ply a 17-year-old explorer with compliments and a silver bracelet. After her repeated rejections, he took her into a vacant house, handcuffed her, and sexually assaulted her, according to police records and her lawsuit. In South Miami, police records show a detective offered to teach teenagers about sex before he assaulted them, so often that some older explorers warned new recruits against being alone with him. And in Porterville, California, a sergeant who led his department's Explorer program took a 17-year-old alone on ride-alongs and complained about his marriage before having sex with her, according to a now settled lawsuit. Supporters of the program, including police officials and scouting leaders, say that abuse cases are rare and represent just a fraction of the tens of thousands of law enforcement explorers over the decades. Some experts say the program helps teenagers become interested in law enforcement, boosting recruitment in a profession that faces labor shortages. Craig Martin, who chairs the National Exploring Program, said one way to keep young people safe is the requirement that adults working with explorers attend a youth protection training at least every 2 years. Martin referred reporters to scouting headquarters for specific answers, but said he believes most abuse in the program took place 25 or more years ago, which, according to the cases we just went over, is not true. And it says in this article, slightly more than half of the cases reporters found occurred since 2000. It can take years for people who are abused to come forward, and many never do. Now, the Marshall Project article continues on to say that the Stoughton police ran the Explorer program for about 15 years. However, the department itself could only locate one single one-year agreement with Learning for Life, which is the scouting affiliate that oversees the National Explorer program. And this agreement, which was signed by Robert Dine in 2010, required the departments to encourage officers to take youth protection training as well as undergo an annual evaluation by Learning for Life. But the agency said it hasn't found records that Dine, the Farwells, or any of its officers completed the training, nor did it locate any records related to an evaluation. And let's just be honest, would a training actually make a difference? I feel like the training would be there to allow you to know how to, determine the signs of abuse, determine the signs of a power imbalance, but would it stop them from being predators? Isn't it kind of just in their nature to be predators? Like, they know the difference between right and wrong. They don't need a training to know that. And I don't think a training would have helped. It also says that since at least the 90s, the Boy Scouts have required a 2-deep leadership rule. And that mandates that 2 adults are present in all of its programs. That way, one adult is never alone with any of the children, but the Boy Scouts carved out an exception to the 2-deep rule for police ride-alongs in the Explorer program. So explorers are actually allowed to ride alone with an officer, though they must be at least 18 to do ride-alongs after midnight, according to the documents on the Learning for Life website. So a lawyer who has represented thousands of clients, including Explorer participants, and who is part of this lawsuit suing the Boy Scouts for sexual abuse, says, quote, "What could possibly go wrong? One adult, no supervision," end quote. Exactly. You have to be 18 to go on a ride along alone with a police officer after midnight, but before midnight, it's fair game. sexual abuse doesn't start at midnight. This isn't Cinderella. In one lawsuit filed in 2019, a woman said a police officer abused her as a teenager in Connecticut. Her lawyers alleged that the Scouts and Learning for Life knew the police departments were not following their policies to prevent sexual abuse. And attorneys for the Boy Scouts have responded by calling child sexual abuse a quote-unquote broad societal problem. Great. The attorneys wrote in a court filing, quote, "This abuse can occur anywhere, even in scouting and explorer programs," end quote. Of course they can. That's obvious. Wherever you're going to have humans, you're going to have human error. You're going to have human greed, human mistakes, human flaws. The point of the matter is, if you knew that there was sexual abuse happening, that's when you enact different policies if you want to keep the program going to make it safer for the teenage participants of that program. Now, in 2022, the Boy Scouts agreed to settle with more than 82,000 people, most of them men who said they were abused as minors in scouting programs. So this wouldn't necessarily be the Explorer program, but the Boy Scouts program. The scouting organization did not say how many Explorer cases are part of the settlement, but that settlement is now about $2.5 billion. So that's kind of crazy. There's a lot happening here between the Boy Scouts and between the Explorer program. So you've got the Boy Scouts having their own allegations of harassment and abuse. Then you have the Explorer program having their own allegations of harassment and abuse. But it seems constant. And the fact that there's how many? 82,000 people in this settlement? That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. So we have Matthew Farwell resigning from the police department in April of 2022. And then on August 15th of that same year, Robert Dine retired from the department, still claiming he never had any relationship with Sandra Birchmore, although there's evidence and proof that he did. And a month later, the Stoughton Police Department wrapped up their 19-month internal investigation into Dine and the Farwell brothers. And Police Chief Donna McNamara claimed that William Farwell had sent Sandra sexually graphic photos of himself while he was on duty. William Farwell is Matthew Farwell's brother. Additionally, William Farwell is accused of not only having multiple inappropriate encounters with Sandra, he's also accused of at least trying to introduce Sandra to other men. Kind of like a pimping thing. It almost feels, I don't know, sex trafficking, right? It's also been revealed that William searched Sandra's name in the police database twice without any reason to do so. And William Farwell was placed on administrative leave in 2022 as well. He's also resigned a few months later. And then he wrote a letter denying all allegations of misconduct. Now, this is interesting because both Matthew and William Farwell have admitted to the police that they had a sexual relationship with Sandra. William says she even told him that she was pregnant with his brother's child. And in the spring of 2021, Matthew Farwell was with a coworker at a local bar when he was also talking about his relationship with Sandra, but he didn't seem sad that she was gone. He didn't seem to be mourning her loss or, the loss of his child. He was simply angry because the state police had focused on him during their investigation. And in December of 2022, the family of Sandra Birchmore filed a wrongful death lawsuit against all three men in Norfolk Superior Court, claiming that these three men, the Farwell brothers and Robert Dine, had groomed and repeatedly sexually abused Sandra for over a decade. The suit also accuses the town of Stoughton and its police department of negligence, the negligence of hiring these three men, and the lawsuit even alleges that when the state medical examiner realized during the autopsy that Sandra was pregnant, they did not send fetal tissue in for DNA testing to determine who the father was, which seems like an important thing to do, right? If you have a woman who turns up dead in kind of a weird way, like hanging off of like a doorknob of a door, this isn't a common way that people take their own lives. When you have that and you find out she's 10 weeks pregnant, and by all, intents and purposes, she seems to be planning to go on with her life, scheduling newborn photo shoots, buying a stroller, scheduling appointments with her OB, things like that. Don't you think you'd want to know who the father of that baby was? And even in this lawsuit, Sandra's family was still discussing her death as if it had been self-inflicted, since that was the official narrative from the Massachusetts State Medical Examiner. But on June 18th, 2024, forensic pathologist Michael Baden released his findings into Sandra's death. The Birchmore family estate had hired Baden to take a second look because, remember, they never actually believed that Sandra would have taken her own life, even though the ME had ruled her death a suicide, and nothing in Sandra's life supported this. So attorney Stephen Marolo, who represents the estate, said that he had asked Michael Baden to review the records of the case after he examined the autopsy, and, quote, he said he saw certain things in the autopsy report that didn't go with the conclusion that it was suicide. I decided at that time we needed to hire our own expert pathologist, end quote. Michael Baden, well known as the former chief medical examiner for the city of New York, he's been involved in many high-profile crime cases for decades, including O.J. Simpson, Kobe Bryant. He even helped the federal government re-examine the deaths of JFK and Martin Luther King Jr. But Baden, he contradicted the state ME, who claimed that Sandra's death had been self-inflicted. And in a letter dated June 18, 2024, he wrote, quote, I must disagree. Miss Birchmore did not die of suicidal hanging. The cause of Miss Birchmore's death is strangulation, and the manner of death is homicide, end quote. Baden mentions that the state's ME's office apparently did not send that fetal tissue in for DNA analysis, and the state police had requested a DNA sample from Matthew Farwell in 2021, but Matthew Farwell basically said, no, I'll pass. I'm all set. I'm not going to give you a DNA sample. Baden also wrote in his report that swabs from Sandra's body, such as hair and fingernail clippings, as well as the clothing she'd been wearing at the time of her death, those had been taken in for a sexual assault kit, but it appeared they too had not been tested. Now, spokespeople for the Massachusetts State Police and the Office of the Medical Examiner have really had no response to these claims, but David Traub, who's a spokesperson for the Norfolk District Attorney, said, quote, DNA testing has been done on items with the potential to produce evidence of the potential crimes being investigated, and other items have been preserved, end quote, which is a really a roundabout way of saying we decided to test some things and not other things, and we're not going to give you a reason for why we decided to test some things and not other things. Michael Baden also said that he noticed Sandra had a fractured right hyoid bone, and this kind of injury, he claims, will rarely, if ever, occur during a self-inflicted hanging, but it does occur in roughly half of homicidal strangulations of women. Baden said this fracture, along with Sandra's other injuries, are, quote, commonly found in homicidal strangulation, manual, and ligature, but not in suicidal hanging, end quote. Baden also wrote that the ligature around Sandra's neck was tangled in her hair, which occurs when there's resistance in homicidal strangulation. And Sandra would have lost consciousness within seconds once that ligature was fastened around her neck, and then death would have occurred within minutes following that. The ligature was also found tied to a doorknob, which Baden believed was done to make it look like a self-inflicted hanging. Now, what's interesting is that in 2021, State Trooper Matthew Dunn, who had found Sandra's body in her bedroom, he reported seeing no indications of physical abuse or bruising, swelling, external trauma, or markings that suggested a struggle. And that was kind of always law enforcement and the medical examiner's stance, where it was okay, in her apartment, on her body, there's no signs of a struggle, there's no signs that she was attacked, there's no signs of foul play or forced entry. Even though you saw a man go into her apartment using a code, and you know that she gave her boyfriend, who's the father of her baby, who's also married, having another baby with his wife, she gave him the code as well as a key to her apartment, and you have a text from him saying, I'll be there in a couple minutes, and then you see him coming in, and then you see him coming out, and then her phone doesn't have any activity after he goes out. Come on. This is kind of an issue here. It's kind of an issue that we have a law enforcement body investigating a crime when that law enforcement body happens to be close to the law enforcement body that the person being investigated, aka Matthew Farwell, works for. This is a little incestuous. And in a recently released affidavit prepared by FBI Special Agent Shanae Castrut, it's revealed that an expert hired to assist in the federal investigation into Sandra's death had also made several conclusions, calling the original medical examiner's ruling into question. Dr. William Smock found that the fracture in Sandra's neck was not consistent with the seated position that she was found in. Additionally, Smock stated that there was skin missing from portions of Sandra's nose, and he said this is consistent with cases of suffocation, and it happens when a person moves their nose back and forth while they're being smothered in an attempt to find oxygen. So I think the question here is pretty obvious. Why did those who initially investigated Sandra's death overlook all of these clear red flags, all of this evidence that says, hey, not so fast. Maybe she didn't do this to herself. And did they overlook them? Did they overlook them, or did they see them and then choose to overlook them? Maybe due to some law enforcement thin blue line loyalty kind of thing, right? The state police detectives very quickly realized, once they had their hands on the case, that not only had Matthew Farwell been having a sexual relationship with Sandra Birchmore, not only had he been doing this with her since she was 15 years old and he was 27, but they realized, based on all of the evidence, that Matthew Farwell was the last person to see Sandra alive. She was pregnant with his child, and he had a reason to not want her to be alive anymore. If anybody had a motive to not want Sandra Birchmore alive based on the text messages, based on the situation, based on what he had to lose, it was Matthew Farwell. Howard Friedman, a civil rights lawyer, says that the police on this case ignored all the evidence that should have left Matthew Farwell the prime suspect. And he said, quote, "They deliberately ignored it. There's no other way to put it," end quote. I actually 100% agree. They deliberately ignored it. Eventually, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston would be brought in to investigate, and Attorney General Andrea Campbell's office confirmed that it was looking into the Stoughton police officers who were involved, specifically the Farwell brothers and Robert Dine, with Campbell stating, quote, "While DA's offices are responsible for prosecuting homicides, my team opened an investigation after I took office into the other aspects of this case, recognizing the seriousness and horror of this case is not limited to Sandra's death," end quote. So basically, Sandra's death opened a can of worms into everything else that was going on beneath the surface at the Stoughton Police Department, and now they're looking into it. And according to the Boston Globe, many people are questioning why outside investigators weren't brought in immediately from the word go, especially after detectives realized Sandra was pregnant and she'd been telling everyone, including Matthew Farwell himself, that he was the father. Now, this would eventually all come to a head, and in August of 2024, 38-year-old Matthew Farwell was arrested in Revere, Massachusetts.
This is the moment that a SWAT team took down former Stoughton police officer Matthew Farwell at a shopping plaza in Revere Wednesday morning. He's now charged in federal court with one count of killing a witness or victim for the disturbing February 2021 death of 23-year-old Sandra Birchmore.
And when it became clear to Mr. Farwell that he could no longer control Sandra Birchmore, he allegedly silenced her permanently.
The state medical examiner initially ruled Sandra's death a suicide, but now, after a thorough investigation, the feds say Sandra was murdered.
What we believe Officer Matthew Farwell did, as outlined in today's indictment, is depraved and a gross betrayal of his sworn oath and the public's trust.
Farwell was charged with one count of killing a witness or victim, and this charge carries a mandatory sentence of death or life in prison. But this case isn't the only one that's raised eyebrows throughout this area of Massachusetts, and many are drawing parallels to the Karen Reed case. I'm going to be honest, I started looking into this case and researching it when it first happened. I'm not as well-versed in this case as I am in most others, but I'll do my best to give you the rundown and then let those who are more up to date on the case explain why these two cases from around the same area speak of a bigger and deeper problem. Allegedly, that's what people are saying. So Karen Reed was charged with killing her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe, in Canton. And remember, this is the same place that Sandra Birchmore lived, Canton, Massachusetts, meaning the same law enforcement body would have responded to both cases. On January 29th, 2022, John O'Keefe's body was found covered in snow outside the home of another police officer in Boston. Now, Karen Reed was arrested for John's murder, although she's always claimed innocence, and she has allegedly given evidence of an elaborate cover-up involving the police and first responders. Now, prosecutors claim that Karen and John had been out drinking that night before she dropped him off outside the home of a friend around midnight, and then she performed a three-point turn. She was drunk, she hit John, her boyfriend, and then she left him to die in the cold, and this was because not necessarily because she was drunk, but it was more nefarious. Like, they had been fighting, she was mad at him, she thought he was going to break up with her, etc., so she was just like, I'll leave him to die. Now, Karen Reed obviously denies this. She claims she dropped her boyfriend off, and that was the last time she saw him, and she believes he was killed inside the home of his friend and fellow police officer before his body was dragged outside and left in the snow.
But how their cases were handled and many say covered up has created a growing community of people who say they are sick and tired of being lied to, and their numbers are growing in size and they're growing in volume. You see some of the protests there. These are the faces of the two cases. One is Karen Reed on the left. You all know about her trial, mistrial, and coming retrial on charges she killed her police officer boyfriend. And the other is Sandra Birchmore, 23 years old and found dead in her apartment back in 2021. Sandra's official cause of death was suicide, but that conclusion is now under considerable doubt. What links these two women together? Well, the tragedies around them happened just a few miles apart, and the police officials accused of cover-ups. They report to the same chain of command, and there could be some striking similarities here. Let me bring in Rob D'Amico. He is a retired FBI supervisory special agent. I also want to welcome back to Banfield Melissa Berry. She is not only a friend of the Birchmore family, she also runs a Facebook group called Justice for Sandra Birchmore. Do you think it is jumping the gun connecting these two cases? Like, what similarities do you see here?
I see the similarities in the police departments and the district attorney's office. And I see it as a cultural thing up there with most likely a police officer killed her and it was ruled a suicide. And it was overshadowed by everyone just not saying it and going with the suicide when nothing pointed to it, none of the evidence pointed to it. And then when you really started looking at the evidence, it was actually pointing to a cop that did this. And then the district attorney and other law enforcement started just going with that story. And I think on the Karen Reed side, this is a worse story because someone was killed by a police officer. And then Karen was accused of killing her ex-boyfriend, and the investigation was so bad, and there was a whole bunch of other things going on. But it's all the same type police and district attorney that's involved.
Mark, what do you make of this case?
You know, this, in a bizarre and unfortunate way, does not surprise me. You may remember, Elizabeth, because you were covering it. In the Karen Reed case, the AJ, Alan Jackson, who was defending Karen Reed, had a wealth of federal material. In fact, two of their witnesses they called in the defense case were related to the Department of Justice. And it always struck me as very peculiar. Why were the feds so intimately involved in the Karen Reed case? This explains everything. If I could connect some purely speculative dots here, it's apparent to me that the feds believed in the Karen Reed case, based on the testimony in the defense case, that the police had set that up, had basically framed her. You now have another case out of that same jurisdiction where they have now formally indicted a police officer, ex-police officer, or soon-to-be ex-police officer, for a homicide in connection and basically setting it up to look like a suicide. It is not far-fetched in the least to believe that the next proverbial shoe to drop is the feds then saying we're also going to file in the Karen Reed case, because I think that they've now got obviously wiretaps. They've obviously got somebody who is cooperating, and they're going to probably take over that police department at some time very soon.
So just so our audience is clear, in both of these cases, the FBI conducted an investigation. In the Farwell case, we know with the woman, the young woman who was pregnant, we know in that case it resulted in charges. In the Karen Reed case, the feds have never revealed what they found in their investigation. Why not?
Well, they have. This is why I say it was interesting. All of that defense case, a lot of what Alan Jackson was doing during the state prosecutor's case in chief was he had access, because under Brady they had to turn it over, meaning the Supreme Court case that says if you have something exculpatory, you must turn it over. He had access to all kinds of Department of Justice material. That led me to believe the Department of Justice was more than just casually involved here. And if they were letting that case go to trial, they wanted to see how it unfolded. They saw how it unfolded. It was astonishing to me. 3,000 miles away just watching it as a casual observer. This, however, really explains what is going on. I think the Department of Justice knows exactly what's happening here, and they've done an investigation such that they feel confident enough to bring charges.
And remember, in the Karen Reed case, we had text messages of the police officers investigating the murder of Officer O'Keefe that were, sexist and misogynistic and disgusting toward Karen Reed. We also had a weird Google search. Karen Reed has always maintained that she was driving drunk that night and that she left O'Keefe, dropped him off at another officer's home. And somebody in that officer's home was Googling how long before somebody dies when left out in the cold. And that's, in fact, how Officer O'Keefe died, in the snowbank outside the home.
And by the way, I would point this out for people who always rush to kind of accept a prosecutorial narrative. That case, the defense was mocked in a lot of quarters, not only by the judge who was presiding in the state court, but, people who were observing and watching. The fact is that if you looked at that case, it's astonishing also to me that jurors hung in that case because it was apparent that this thing was staged in Karen Reed. And now we've got the imprint, if you will, of the feds saying, hey, wait a second here. This case, which was supposedly a suicide, in spite of the fact that this young lady was looking forward to the birth of the child, was not in fact a suicide, and in fact had been manipulated, and the crime scene had been manipulated. Sound familiar? It rings and resonates from what happened in Karen Reed. It's almost like they've got a playbook over there.
And there's been a ton of protesters who have taken to the streets to show their dissatisfaction with the local police in this Massachusetts area. It says more than 100 protesters gathered in front of the Massachusetts State House Thursday to protest the prosecution of Karen Reed, as well as what they believe is police corruption in a number of cases. It says that this protest was already planned, but it happened to fall one day after the Norfolk County District Attorney, Michael Morrissey, who is a very controversial figure in this whole thing that's happening with Karen Reed and Sandra Birchmore and the whole police corruption in the Massachusetts area thing. His name is being brought up all the time, but it came a day after he announced that he'd appointed a special prosecutor to try Karen Reed in her second trial, which is scheduled for this coming January. Karen Reed's supporters, who believe she's being framed in the death of her boyfriend, John O'Keefe, are criticizing Morrissey for his choice of special prosecutor formerly associated with the mobster, because the person that Morrissey chose to be the special prosecutor is a guy named Hank Brennan. He's a private defense attorney who represented Whitey Bulger in 2013. And I don't see the issue with it, but apparently people don't like it. Paul Cristofaro, who organized the rally on Thursday and who's a supporter of Karen Reed, said, quote, look at some of the people he represented. And when he was asked if he had any confidence that the district attorney's office was working to correct the so-called corruption that it's been accused of by hiring a third-party prosecutor for the case, Paul Cristofaro said, no, it doesn't. This doesn't even touch on the corruption. So basically, the people and criminal justice experts, they're using Karen Reed's case and Sandra Birchmore's case to basically say that there's a need to get rid of the Massachusetts model of investigating high-profile crimes and start from scratch. Criminal justice journalist Susan Zalkind posted on Twitter, or X, on Wednesday, quote, understatement of the century, but Massachusetts has a serious problem with murder investigations involving police suspects, witnesses, and leads, end quote. And honestly, I think every police department does struggle with investigating one of their own, or more than one of their own in this case. The experts are suggesting an alternative model that's used in states like Florida and Georgia, where there's an independent investigative agency to oversee the cases instead of relying on an agency that enforces laws on highways. Basically, this person here, Tom Nolan, who's a former Boston police lieutenant and now a criminal justice professor, said, quote, we saw on full display for several weeks during the Karen Reed trial the bumbling incompetence of the Massachusetts State Police, who were assigned to the Norfolk DA's office. Her defense counsel just basically eviscerated the state police troopers who were testifying as witnesses and experts. Expert witnesses. Their credibility was completely undermined. End quote. Yeah, so basically they're saying there's an issue with corruption, which is going to be interesting because there's been new information that's come out. But first, I want to tell you what's going on with Matthew Farwell. So obviously he's arrested. He was indicted by a grand jury. There had initially been a detention hearing scheduled, which would have decided, whether or not he stayed in jail, whether or not he got bail. But this hearing was canceled after Farwell agreed to stay in custody while he retained his right to request a detention hearing at a later time. And this way, his attorney would have more time to work through the case. A judge also approved a motion that was filed by the prosecution because the prosecution asked the court for a protective order, which would restrict the use and dissemination of information in the case. And this would include things like crime scene photos depicting Sandra's body, autopsy photos, Sandra's phone and laptop extractions, her medical records, and police reports that gave witness names. The prosecution said they do not want Farwell to be allowed to review these materials unless his lawyer or other members of his defense team are present. And this way, this should hopefully prevent the unauthorized dissemination and distribution of the protected information, which, quote, the government believes could expose the victim or witnesses to significant safety and or privacy risks, end quote. Now, what does this mean to me? This means they don't want Matthew Farwell to know who the witnesses against him are. They don't want him to know the identity of these people. They don't mind him knowing what they've said against him or about him, but they don't want him to know the identity of these people and why. Well, first of all, it's because allegedly, because he's been charged with murder, Matthew Farwell has no problem taking out people who he considers to be roadblocks to him or he considers to be a threat to him. And secondly, Matthew Farwell still has police friends. So much like a kind of criminal organization, a corrupt police force is going to behave in a way of where they're going to close ranks and protect their own. So he could technically give someone a call, be like, hey, here's a name, take care of this person for me. And this witness is now either intimidated, threatened, or, worse, just offed completely. So that's where we stand with Matthew Farwell. He's in jail. He's awaiting trial. We'll see what happens there. But I had to wait to record this video because in recent events, an audio recording that was never supposed to be released has emerged. And it's going to give us a lot more insight into how deep this thing goes. So I'm going to play a news clip for you right now. And then afterwards, we're going to discuss it.
Former Stoughton police officer Matthew Farwell remains in federal custody, charged with killing Sandra Birchmore. State police initially ruled her death a suicide. 25 Investigates is looking back and at a different cop Birchmore knew named Joshua Heel. We have a recording that was never supposed to be made public.
When Stoughton police revealed that 3 of their officers had troubling relationships with Sandra Birchmore, the name of an Abington cop also surfaced. Josh Heel previously worked for Stoughton's Animal Control.
The deputy told me that Heel and the deceased woman were friends and that they had texted quite frequently. I believe it was daily. There was a lot of digital information, he said, and he was hoping that Josh would help him connect the dots.
Can you guys just identify yourselves for the recording?
25 Investigates has obtained a recording of then Abington Police Chief David Del Papa in a formal interview with a town attorney. Del Papa says he was told in December 2021 that Josh Heel was a witness in Stoughton's probe. Here he describes getting new information 3 months later.
Birchmore was known to several members of the department as having mental health issues. Sandra had disclosed details about her relationships with other members of the department to Josh.
And according to Del Papa, Heel also had a sexual encounter with Birchmore.
The chief had disclosed to me that he had received oral sex from a woman, and I basically told him that it happened off duty and extramarital affairs on any of my business.
And this is a guy who was working at schools at the time.
That's right. Josh Heel was an Abington school resource officer and police comfort dog handler. Kirk Minahan reported extensively on Birchmore and Heel in season 2 of his podcast called The Case.
It seems to me, minute 1, you find out, you put this guy on leave until you figure your stuff out. And if he's exonerated, fine, back to work. But of course, he wasn't exonerated.
Heel continued to work in the schools for another 6 months until the day after Del Papa learned that Heel's name had been mistakenly left unredacted in a report that was going to be shared with the media.
They wanted to give us a heads up because it was going to be a disaster. So I got off the phone. I called Josh in and told him, you're on admin leave. At that point, I still didn't know the full breadth of Stoughton's investigation as far as one of the officers having relations with this woman when she was underage and all that.
We asked Abington Town Manager Scott Lambiase if Heel should have been taken out of the schools sooner, based on what Del Papa did know.
You know, as a police officer and a member of the union, civil service, there's steps that you have to go through before you can actually put somebody on administrative leave or begin an investigation. But I believe that once we actually knew the full depth and confirmation on what had actually happened, we acted pretty quickly.
Heel remained on paid leave until he resigned in early 2023. In a statement, Heel's attorney tells 25 Investigates Heel is a material witness and Mr. Heel has not now, has not been ever, and is not going to be the target of any criminal charges in the future because he has not broken any laws. Del Papa stepped down in May 2024 in what the town describes as a mutual separation. Abington hired an outside investigator that concluded Del Papa was professional and diligent in his handling of Heel. Del Papa tells us what happened to Birchmore is an absolute tragedy. He says, given the very limited information, my response was appropriate to what I knew at the time. Kirk Minahan sees it differently.
The buck was passed a lot of times. I think Del Papa should own up for his failures in this entire situation.
Days before Del Papa placed Heel on leave, he learned that Heel had texted, quote, graphic and filthy things with Birchmore while on duty. Del Papa also became aware that Heel created an unauthorized Instagram account named after his police comfort dog. Heel no longer works as a police officer.
So we have this other police officer, Joshua Heel, who was serving as the Abington School Resource Officer at the time. Heel met Birchmore when she was a young adult while he was working in his prior role as the Stoughton Animal Control Officer. Stoughton Police Chief Robert Holmes first contacted this other police officer, and this other person's name is Abington Police Chief David Del Papa. And Del Papa was contacted by Robert Holmes in December of 2021 so that he could be aware of the internal affairs investigation that Stoughton Police had launched into text messages that Massachusetts State Police detectives had pulled from Sandra Birchmore's mobile phone after she was found dead. So Del Papa is claiming that this deputy, Holmes, told him that Joshua Heel and Sandra Birchmore were like really close friends. They were texting all the time, daily. You can hear Del Papa say in the recording, and that there was a lot of digital information. And Holmes was hoping that Josh Heel would kind of help them connect the dots. Now, 2 weeks after this, Holmes interviewed Josh Heel, but according to Del Papa, Heel ended that conversation because he felt like he was being treated as a suspect. So Del Papa then ordered Heel to speak to Holmes. A second interview took place in February 2021, and Del Papa said he still understood Heel to be a witness in the investigation, despite Heel requesting a lawyer. The following month, Holmes told Del Papa that Sandra Birchmore was known to have mental health issues and that Josh Heel had received oral sex from Birchmore off duty when she was a young adult. Del Papa said that he was told by Holmes that Birchmore had, quote, disclosed details about her relationship with other members of the Stoughton Police Department to Josh in explicit detail, end quote. So there's this podcast called The Case done by Kirk Minahan. And this podcast is about Sandra Birchmore. And in this podcast, Kirk Minahan basically says that Del Papa should have seen the red flags and put Joshua Heel on leave the second he realized that he was involved with Sandra Birchmore in a more personal and less professional way. Minahan said, quote, Heel has sort of gone under the radar, and he shouldn't. It seems to me, minute one, you find out, you put this guy on leave until you figure stuff out, and he's exonerated. Fine, back to work. But of course, he wasn't exonerated, End quote. Now, in a statement, Del Papa said that Abington's review of his actions found him to be professional and diligent in his handling of Heel. And Abington's report states that Del Papa, quote, was challenged throughout the entire SPD, which is the Stoughton Police Department investigation, receiving limited information from Holmes and SPD specific to Heel. End quote. This article here from 25 News, it says that Heel continued to work in Abington schools for 6 more months until September 22, 2022. And this was the day that Del Papa learned from a law firm that Heel's name had been mistakenly left unredacted in a report Stoughton police were about to release to the media about Sandra Birchmore's relationship with the Stoughton officers Matthew Farwell, William Farwell, Robert Dine, and also Joshua Heel. You can hear in this recording that Del Papa says he basically got the heads up because they knew it was going to be a disaster. He got on the phone, he called Josh Heel, and he told him, I think you're on administrative leave. He did not put this man on administrative leave until he knew that the public was going to find out about his involvement with Sandra Birchmore, even though Del Papa and others in the police, they knew about Joshua Heel's involvement with Sandra Birchmore. So this is not helping with the allegations of police cover-up and corruption. Not at all. We also have the Stoughton Deputy Police Chief, Robert Holmes, talk to Del Papa 2 days before Del Papa was aware that Joshua Heel's name had been left unredacted in that report. And I guess they met at a Walgreens. And at that time, Holmes told Del Papa that Heel was not credible and warned him, quote, I don't think you want him around children, end quote. Because remember, Joshua Heel is working in schools at this time as an education officer. Del Papa said he was still weighing that information when he learned that Heel's name was in Stoughton's report. So you had to weigh that information for 2 days. A fellow law enforcement officer said, hey, this guy has clearly, we have evidence and proof that he was having interactions with this young girl, that he knew about what she was doing with other police officers, and you've got him in schools, you might want to get him out. And it took you 2 days to weigh that information, and you didn't actually put Joshua Heel on an administrative leave until you knew his name was going to be leaked to the public and that there would be an outcry to do so and that they would be asking you why you hadn't. At the Walgreens meeting, in this recording you can hear Del Papa said that Holmes also revealed, quote, Josh and Miss Birchmore had texted filthy things back and forth to each other. He said Josh tried to have sex with her friend while he was married. He said Josh was interested in the friend because she was a virgin, end quote. Heel remained on paid administrative leave until February of 2023 when he, too, submitted his resignation. Del Papa left Abington in May in what was described as a mutual separation from the town. He was provided a letter of recommendation, and according to his separation agreement, he will be paid through May of 2025. By who? By you, the taxpayers. Del Papa told 25 Investigates, quote, what happened to Sandra Birchmore is an absolute tragedy. I pray that justice is served soon and it will provide her family some semblance of comfort in the aftermath of this truly horrific event, end quote. So do we think that Del Papa should have acted sooner, that as soon as he found out about Josh Heel's involvement with Sandra Birchmore, that his involvement went beyond professional and went into the personal, that maybe Josh Heel should have been placed on administrative leave until they figured out what the hell was going on? Do you think that Del Papa didn't act fast enough? Because I think he didn't. And I think he only acted because of optics, because of how it would look. That's the only time you can get police officers who have closed ranks to actually, and this isn't just related to police officers, it's politicians, it's, a whole bunch of different groups that close ranks around each other, and then they don't actually do anything that they should until they're afraid that the public's going to find out, until they're afraid that their dark secrets and all the things they're trying to hide are going to come out into the light, and then they take action. And honestly, too little, too late. So that's how I feel about it. And that's where we're kind of at right now. Let me know what you think about this. I know this was probably a quicker video, but I wanted to get this out. I want Sandra's story to be told, and I want her to have justice. As far as Karen Reed, I don't really know how I feel about this. Like I said, I don't have enough information. I haven't investigated or researched enough. I don't think it's as cut and dry as that she's completely being framed by the police department, but I'll have to look into it more. Let me know what you think about it. Those of you who have been following it, let me know what you think about it in the comments. Don't forget to like this video if you liked it. Share it if you think it's worth sharing. and subscribe if you haven't already, because there's a lot of you who watch who aren't subscribed. So hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, share the video. And thank you so much for being here. Until next time, stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and I'll see you very soon.